Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carefully cleaned the massive Barrett M82 rifle. The weapon weighed nearly 30 pounds and stretched almost 5 feet long. Every piece of metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the military training facility. She had been working on this particular rifle for over an hour, making sure every component was spotless. The shooting range buzzed with activity around her. Soldiers moved back and forth, preparing their equipment for the day's training exercises. The smell of gun oil and metal polish filled the air. Sarah focused intensely on her work, using a small brush to clean the intricate parts of the rifle's mechanism. She had always been meticulous about maintaining equipment, a habit that had served her well throughout her military career. From across the room, Sergeant Mike Reynolds watched her with amusement. He leaned against a table filled with ammunition boxes, his arms crossed over his chest. A smirk played across his face as he observed Sarah's careful attention to detail. Mike had been at this base for 3 years and considered himself one of the best marksmen in the unit. He had never seen Sarah shoot before, only clean weapons and organize equipment. "Look at Martinez over there," Mike said to his buddy Corporal Jenkins, who was loading magazines nearby. "She's been polishing that Barrett for an hour. Probably doesn't even know which end the bullet comes out of." Jenkins chuckled but kept his voice low. "Maybe she's just being thorough, Mike. You know how important weapon maintenance is." Mike shook his head, his smirk growing wider. "There's being thorough, and then there's whatever this is. I bet she's never even fired a Barrett before. Those things have a kick that would knock her flat on her back." The conversation wasn't entirely quiet, and a few other soldiers began to take notice. The Barrett M82 was known as one of the most powerful sniper rifles in the world. It fired 50 caliber rounds that could disable vehicles and eliminate targets from over a mile away. The recoil was legendary among shooters, capable of bruising the shoulder of even experienced marksmen. Sarah continued her work, seemingly oblivious to the growing attention. She disassembled the rifle's bolt assembly and cleaned each piece individually. Her movements were confident and practiced, suggesting she had done this many times before. She wore standard military fatigues, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her appearance that would suggest exceptional shooting skills. The training facility was preparing for a special demonstration that afternoon. A group of visiting military officials would observe various shooting exercises and equipment displays. The Barrett rifle that Sarah was cleaning would be part of the demonstration, along with several other high-powered weapons. The pressure was on to make sure everything ran smoothly. Captain Williams, the unit commander, walked through the facility checking on preparations. He stopped briefly at Sarah's station and nodded approvingly at her work. "Good job, Martinez. That Barrett needs to be perfect for this afternoon's demonstration." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "It'll be ready." Mike watched this exchange with continued amusement. He had heard through the grapevine that Sarah had recently transferred from another unit, but nobody seemed to know much about her background. Her personnel file was apparently classified at a higher level than most soldiers had access to. This only added to Mike's assumption that she was probably some kind of administrative specialist who had been assigned to equipment maintenance. As Sarah worked, more soldiers began to gather in small groups around the facility. Word was spreading about the afternoon demonstration, and everyone wanted to make sure they would have a good view. The Barrett rifle was always a crowd favorite due to its impressive size and legendary stopping power. Many of the soldiers had never actually seen one fired in person. Mike decided to approach Sarah's workstation. He walked over casually, his hands in his pockets, maintaining that same amused expression. Several other soldiers followed, curious to see what would happen. "Hey, Martinez," Mike said, his voice carrying just enough volume for others to hear. "That's quite a weapon you're working on there. Ever actually shot one of those before?" Sarah looked up from her work for the first time in over an hour. Her eyes met Mike's directly, and she studied his face for a moment before responding. "I've had some experience with various weapons systems," she said simply, then returned to her cleaning. This diplomatic answer only increased Mike's confidence in his assessment. "Some experience with various weapons systems," he repeated, mimicking. her formal tone. That's military speak for I've read the manual but never pulled the trigger. A few of the gathered soldiers chuckled at Mike's comment. Sarah didn't react visibly, continuing to clean the rifle's scope mounts with the same methodical precision she had shown all morning. Her lack of response seemed to encourage Mike to continue. You know, that Barrett there has a recoil energy of about 127 foot-pounds, Mike said, warming up to his audience. That's enough to knock most people clean off their feet if they're not ready for it. Probably weighs more than you do when it's fully loaded. Sarah finally looked up again, this time with what might have been the slightest hint of a smile. Is that so? She asked quietly. Mike nodded confidently. Oh yeah, takes years of training to handle one of those properly. Most soldiers never get the chance to fire one because of the specialized training required. It's not like the rifles we use in basic training. The group of watching soldiers had grown larger, drawn by the developing conversation. Some seemed uncomfortable with Mike's increasingly condescending tone, while others appeared curious to see how Sarah would respond. The tension in the room was subtle but growing. Sarah set down her cleaning cloth and looked at the assembled group of soldiers. For a moment she seemed to be considering something carefully. Then she returned to her work, making a final check of the rifle's barrel in action. Well, she said quietly, I suppose we'll see this afternoon during the demonstration. Mike's smirk broadened into a full grin. He felt he had successfully made his point about Sarah's inexperience with serious weapons. In his mind, her non-committal response confirmed his suspicions that she was all maintenance and no marksmanship. What none of them knew was that Sarah's personnel file contained information that would have completely changed the dynamic of this conversation. But those details remained locked away in classified databases, leaving Mike and the other soldiers to make their assumptions based on incomplete information. The morning continued with various preparations for the afternoon's demonstration, but the encounter had set something in motion that would soon surprise everyone involved. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as soldiers gathered around the outdoor shooting range. The demonstration was about to begin, and excitement filled the air. Several high-ranking military officials sat in folding chairs under a canvas tent, their uniforms decorated with ribbons and insignia that spoke of years of distinguished service. They had traveled from headquarters specifically to observe this training facility's capabilities. Captain Williams stood before the assembled crowd with a clipboard in his hand. Behind him, a long table displayed various weapons that would be demonstrated throughout the afternoon. The Barrett M82 that Sarah had spent the morning cleaning sat prominently in the center, its black metal surface gleaming in the sunlight. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Williams announced, his voice carrying across the range, today we'll be demonstrating the capabilities of several weapon systems currently in use by our forces. Each demonstration will show both the technical specifications and practical applications of these weapons in field conditions. Mike Reynolds positioned himself near the front of the crowd, eager to watch what he expected would be an embarrassing moment for Sarah. He had spent the lunch break telling more soldiers about his morning conversation with her, building up the anticipation for what he believed would be a clear demonstration of her inexperience with serious firearms. Sarah stood quietly near the weapons table, checking a sheet of paper that listed the afternoon's schedule. She had changed into a different set of fatigues, these ones showing more wear and fading than her morning uniform. A few soldiers noticed that her boots were different too. They were well-worn combat boots rather than the standard-issue ones most personnel wore around the base. The first demonstration involved a standard M16 rifle. Corporal Jenkins stepped forward and efficiently showed the weapon's basic operation, firing several rounds into targets at different distances. The visiting officials took notes and asked technical questions about ammunition capacity and effective range. It was a professional but routine demonstration that served as a warm-up for the more impressive weapons to follow. Next came a demonstration of a grenade launcher, followed by a machine gun setup. Each presentation was thorough and well executed, with soldiers who clearly knew their weapons inside and out. The officials appeared satisfied with what they were seeing, occasionally nodding to each other and making comments in low voices. As the afternoon progressed, the crowd's attention increasingly focused on the Barrett rifle. Everyone knew it would be the highlight of the demonstration. The weapon's reputation preceded it. Stories of incredible accuracy at impossible distances, of single shots that could stop vehicles or eliminate targets that other rifles couldn't even reach. And now, Captain Williams announced, we come to our final demonstration of the day. The Barrett M82, also known as the Light 50, is a semi-automatic anti-materiel rifle chambered in 50 BMG. With an effective range of over 1,800 meters, it's one of the most powerful weapons in our arsenal. Mike leaned forward in anticipation. He expected Captain Williams to call forward one of the unit's designated marksmen for this demonstration. These were soldiers with specialized training and extensive experience with high-powered rifles. Instead, he heard something that made his smirk falter. Specialist Martinez will be conducting today's Barrett demonstration. A murmur ran through the crowd. Many soldiers were surprised by this choice, though not all for the same reasons as Mike. Some were simply curious to see how someone they didn't know well would handle such an impressive weapon. Others had begun to suspect that there might be more to Sarah than met the eye. Sarah stepped forward and picked up the Barrett rifle with practiced ease. Despite its considerable weight and size, she handled it as if it were no heavier than a standard rifle. She checked the weapon's safety, inspected the scope, and ran through what appeared to be a familiar pre-firing routine. The target for this demonstration, Captain Williams continued, is located at 200 meters downrange. This distance represents a typical engagement range for this weapon system in field conditions. The crowd turned to look down the range, where a vehicle target was barely visible in the distance. Even with binoculars, it appeared as little more than a dark speck against the desert backdrop. The idea of hitting such a distant target with a single shot seemed almost impossible to many of the watching soldiers. Sarah positioned herself at the firing line and began setting up for the shot. She extended the rifle's bipod legs and adjusted them for height. Her movements were methodical and confident, showing none of the uncertainty that Mike had expected. She settled into a prone position behind the weapon and began making adjustments to the scope. Mike watched with growing confusion. Sarah's body position was textbook perfect. Her left arm supported the rifle's stock, her right hand gripped it properly, and her body alignment was exactly what advanced marksmanship manuals recommended. This wasn't the fumbling inexperience he had anticipated. The visiting officials leaned forward in their chairs, clearly interested in seeing this demonstration. One of them, a colonel with graying hair and numerous combat ribbons, pulled out his own binoculars to observe the distant target. His expression suggested he was taking this demonstration seriously. Sarah made final adjustments to her position and scope settings. The range fell quiet as everyone realized the shot was imminent. Even conversation stopped as soldiers focused their attention on the woman behind the massive rifle. The only sounds were the slight desert breeze and the distant hum of the facility's generators. "Range is clear," called out the range safety officer. "You are cleared to fire when ready." Sarah took a deep breath and let half of it out, a standard marksmanship technique for steadying aim. Her finger moved to the trigger, and she began applying pressure gradually rather than jerking it quickly. The Barrett's trigger had a crisp breakpoint that required smooth, consistent pressure to achieve accuracy. Mike found himself holding his breath along with most of the other spectators. Despite his earlier confidence about Sarah's inexperience, something about her professional setup routine had begun to plant seeds of doubt in his mind. She looked nothing like someone who had never fired a Barrett before. The rifle's scope crosshairs settled on the distant target. Sarah made a final microscopic adjustment to compensate for wind conditions that were barely perceptible to the observers, but critical for long-range accuracy. Her breathing settled into a controlled rhythm as she prepared for what everyone expected would be either an impressive hit or an embarrassing miss. The moment stretched out as Sarah held her aim steady. The crowd remained silent, all eyes focused on her position behind the massive rifle. Some soldiers had their own binoculars trained on the distant target, eager to spot the impact immediately. Others watched Sarah herself, fascinated by her calm professionalism. In that suspended moment before the shot, Mike's earlier confidence had transformed into genuine curiosity. Whatever happened next would either confirm his assumptions about Sarah's abilities or prove that he had seriously misjudged the quiet soldier who had spent the morning meticulously cleaning the weapon she now prepared to fire. The Barrett M82 erupted with a thunderous boom that echoed across the desert landscape. The muzzle flash illuminated Sarah's face for a split second, showing an expression of calm concentration rather than the shock or surprise that many expected from someone supposedly inexperienced with such powerful weapons. The rifle's recoil drove back into her shoulder, but her body absorbed it smoothly, barely moving from her carefully positioned stance. The crowd instinctively turned their attention, downrange toward the distant target. For several seconds, there was only silence as everyone strained to see the result of the shot. The target was so far away that spotting the impact required either binoculars or exceptional eyesight. Dust clouds and heat waves made observation even more challenging. Then came the voice of Sergeant Davis, who was stationed downrange with a powerful spotting scope and radio communication. His voice crackled through the speaker system with barely contained excitement. Hit! Direct hit on target center mass. A collective gasp arose from the assembled soldiers. Many had expected Sarah to miss entirely, given the extreme distance and challenging conditions. Even experienced marksmen sometimes struggled with their first shots on the Barrett, due to its unique characteristics and powerful recoil. Mike Reynolds stood frozen in disbelief. His mouth hung slightly open as he processed what had just happened. The woman he had been mocking all morning for her supposed inexperience had just made what many would consider an expert-level shot on her first attempt. His earlier smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by confusion and growing embarrassment. Colonel Harrison, the senior visiting official, lowered his binoculars with an impressed expression. He turned to Captain Williams and said something, in a low voice that made the captain nod respectfully. Other officials were taking notes more rapidly now, clearly recognizing that they had witnessed something significant. Sarah remained in position behind the rifle, calmly working the bolt. To eject the spent cartridge case, the massive .50 caliber brass casing flew out and landed in the sand beside her, with a metallic clink. She made no gesture of celebration or acknowledgement of the crowd's reaction. Instead, she simply began preparing for what everyone assumed would be her second and final demonstration shot. Outstanding shot, Specialist Martinez, Captain Williams announced over the loudspeaker. Please prepare for your second demonstration round. This surprised many of the spectators. Most weapon demonstrations involved only a single shot to show basic capability. The fact that Sarah was being asked to shoot again suggested that the visiting officials wanted to confirm that her first hit wasn't simply luck. A single perfect shot could be attributed to chance, but consistent accuracy would prove genuine skill. Mike watched with growing anxiety as Sarah loaded another cartridge into the Barrett's chamber. His earlier confidence about her abilities had been completely shattered by that first shot, and now he faced the possibility that she might prove her skills beyond any doubt. Several other soldiers who had overheard his morning comments were glancing in his direction with knowing looks. Sarah settled back into her firing position with the same methodical precision she had shown before. She made slight adjustments to her scope settings, accounting for the fact that the first shot might have provided data about wind conditions and other environmental factors. This kind of shot-to-shot adjustment was the mark of an experienced, long-range shooter. The range fell silent again as spectators prepared for the second shot. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Instead of curious doubt about Sarah's abilities, there was genuine anticipation about what an apparently skilled marksman might accomplish. The respectful quiet of people watching an expert at work replaced the earlier buzz of skeptical conversation. Colonel Harrison raised his binoculars again, focusing intently on the distant target area. His decades of military experience had taught him to recognize genuine skill when he saw it, and Sarah's first shot had clearly impressed him. He was curious to see whether she could repeat her performance under the added pressure of heightened expectations. Sarah's breathing settled into the same controlled rhythm she had used for her first shot. The Barrett's crosshairs found the target, again, and she began the slow, steady trigger press that would send another .50 caliber round downrange at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Her finger moved with the same smooth precision that had characterized her entire demonstration. The second shot rang out with identical authority to the first. The muzzle blast kicked up sand around the firing position, and the characteristic crack of the supersonic bullet echoed across the desert. Sarah's body again absorbed the recoil with practiced ease, confirming that her first shot's steady handling hadn't been a fluke. This time, the wait for target confirmation seemed shorter, perhaps because Sergeant Davis was more prepared for the possibility of another hit. His voice came through the speakers with even greater enthusiasm than before. Another hit. Dead center again. 2 for 2 on target. The crowd's reaction was more subdued this time, but more genuine. Instead of surprised gasps, there were nods of professional appreciation and quiet comments acknowledging Sarah's obvious skill. Several soldiers began reassessing everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who had been cleaning weapons that morning. Mike Reynolds felt a sick feeling growing in his stomach. Not only had his assumptions about Sarah been completely wrong, but he had made those assumptions publicly and with considerable arrogance. Other soldiers were beginning to look at him with expressions ranging from amusement to disapproval, clearly remembering his earlier comments about Sarah's supposed inexperience. Captain Williams approached Sarah's position as she safed the rifle and began her post-firing procedures. Excellent shooting, Specialist Martinez. The officials are very impressed with your demonstration. Sarah nodded professionally but didn't appear particularly surprised by her performance. Thank you, sir. The rifle was properly zeroed and conditions were favorable for long-range shooting. Her matter-of-fact response to what others considered exceptional marksmanship only added to the growing mystery about her background. Most soldiers would have shown at least some satisfaction after making 2 consecutive hits at 200 meters with a weapon they supposedly had little experience with. As the crowd began to disperse and the demonstration officially ended, conversations buzzed with speculation about Sarah's background and training. It was becoming clear that her personnel file might contain information that would explain her unexpected expertise with the Barrett rifle. The demonstration had officially ended, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Small groups of soldiers clustered around the range, discussing what they had just witnessed. The visiting officials were engaged in animated conversation with Captain Williams, occasionally glancing toward Sarah as she methodically cleaned the Barrett rifle for the second time that day. Mike Reynolds stood alone near the ammunition table, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Several soldiers who had heard his morning comments approached him with barely concealed grins. Corporal Jenkins was the first to speak up. So, Mike, what was that you were saying about Martinez not knowing which end the bullet comes out of? Jenkins asked, his tone carrying just enough sarcasm to make the point without being cruel. Mike's face flushed red as he struggled for a response. Well, nobody told me she was trained on that weapon. How was I supposed to know? Private Thompson, who had been part of the morning crowd around Sarah's workstation, shook his head with a knowing smile. Maybe that's the point, Mike. Maybe you weren't supposed to assume anything about her abilities based on seeing her clean a rifle. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Harrison's approach. The senior officer had finished his discussion with Captain Williams and was walking directly toward Sarah's position. His expression was serious but not unfriendly, suggesting he had questions rather than criticisms about her performance. Specialist Martinez, the colonel said as he reached her workstation. That was impressive shooting. Mind if I ask about your training background? Sarah looked up from her cleaning and came to attention. Sir, I completed advanced marksmanship training at several facilities before being assigned to this unit. My previous unit specialized in long-range reconnaissance and target elimination. This simple statement hit the listening soldiers like a bombshell. Long-range reconnaissance units were elite formations that required extensive screening and specialized training. Members of such units were typically among the most skilled marksmen in the military, trained to operate independently behind enemy lines and eliminate high-value targets from extreme distances. Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. I see. And what's your personal best for distance shooting, if you don't mind me asking? Confirmed kill at 2,847 meters, sir, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Conditions were optimal, and the target was stationary. The soldiers within earshot fell completely silent. A confirmed kill at nearly 2,950 meters was the kind of achievement that made military history. Only a handful of snipers worldwide had ever made successful shots at such extreme distances, and those who had were legendary figures whose exploits were studied in advanced marksmanship courses. Mike Reynolds felt as if the ground had opened up beneath his feet. Not only had he been wrong about Sarah's abilities, but he had been mocking someone whose skills far exceeded anything he could ever hope to achieve. The woman he had assumed was inexperienced with serious weapons was actually one of the most elite marksmen in the entire military. Colonel Harrison's expression showed genuine respect now. Outstanding specialist. Your reputation preceded you, but I wanted to see your skills firsthand before making my recommendation. Recommendation, sir? Sarah asked. There's a specialized training program being established for extreme long-range interdiction. They're looking for instructors with proven field experience and exceptional marksmanship skills. Based on what I've seen today and your service record, I believe you'd be an ideal candidate. Sarah considered this for a moment before responding. I'd be honored to be considered, sir. As Colonel Harrison walked away to rejoin the other officials, the soldiers around Sarah's workstation looked at her with completely different eyes. The quiet woman who had spent the morning cleaning weapons was revealed to be one of the military's most elite specialists, someone whose skills were so exceptional that senior officers were offering her positions as an instructor. Captain Williams appeared at Sarah's side as she finished packing away the cleaning supplies. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I should have briefed the unit about your background when you arrived. Some of the comments this morning were inappropriate. Sarah shrugged slightly. No harm done, sir. I prefer to let my work speak for itself. Mike? Reynolds knew he needed to approach Sarah and apologize for his earlier behavior, but he struggled to find the courage. His assumptions had been so completely wrong, and his comments so condescending, that he wasn't sure how to begin making amends. Several other soldiers were watching him expectantly, clearly waiting to see if he would do the right thing. Finally, Mike forced himself to walk over to Sarah's workstation. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral and professional. The earlier hint of a smile was gone, replaced by the same quiet competence she had shown all day. Martinez, Mike began, his voice uncertain. I owe you a major apology. The things I said this morning were way out of line. I made assumptions about your abilities without knowing anything about your background. Sarah studied his face for a moment before responding. Apology accepted, Sergeant Reynolds. We all make mistakes. Her gracious response only made Mike feel worse about his earlier behavior. She could have embarrassed him further or made a point of his error, but instead, she was showing the kind of professionalism that her elite training had undoubtedly instilled. I was wondering, Mike continued, if you might be willing to share some training tips with those of us who are trying to improve our long-range shooting. I realize now that there's a lot I could learn. This request sparked interest from several other soldiers who had been listening to the conversation. The opportunity to receive instruction from someone with Sarah's demonstrated abilities was incredibly valuable, something that would normally require attending specialized schools or advanced courses. Sarah considered the request thoughtfully. I could probably arrange some informal training sessions during off-duty hours. Long-range marksmanship requires a lot of practice and attention to fundamentals that many people overlook. The offer was met with enthusiasm from multiple soldiers. Even those who hadn't been part of the morning's inappropriate comments were eager to learn from someone with such exceptional skills. Sarah's willingness to share her knowledge despite the earlier disrespect showed a level of professionalism that impressed everyone present. As the afternoon wound down and soldiers began returning to their regular duties, the atmosphere around the range had completely changed. Sarah was no longer the unknown maintenance specialist that some had assumed her to be. She was now recognized as one of the unit's most valuable assets, someone whose skills and experience far exceeded what her quiet demeanor had initially suggested. The day's events had taught everyone involved a valuable lesson about the dangers of making assumptions about others, based on limited information or superficial observations. 2 weeks had passed since the demonstration, and the atmosphere at the training facility had undergone a complete transformation. Sarah's informal marksmanship training sessions had become the most sought-after learning opportunity on the base. Every evening after regular duties, soldiers gathered at the range to learn from someone whose skills had proven to be truly exceptional. Mike Reynolds had become one of Sarah's most dedicated students. His initial embarrassment had evolved into genuine respect and a hunger to learn everything he could from her expertise. The arrogance that had characterized his earlier behavior had been replaced by humility and a recognition of how much he still had to learn about advanced marksmanship. The key to long-range shooting, Sarah explained to a group of 8 soldiers positioned around her at the range, isn't just about having steady hands or good eyes. It's about understanding how dozens of different factors interact to affect your bullet's path over extreme distances. She pointed to a weather station mounted nearby. Wind speed and direction change constantly, sometimes several times during a single shot sequence. Temperature affects air density, which changes how your bullet flies. Humidity, barometric pressure, even the rotation of the earth become factors when you're shooting at distances over 1,000 meters. The soldiers listened intently, many taking notes in small notebooks. This kind of detailed instruction was normally only available at specialized sniper schools, which required months-long commitments and extensive security clearances. Having access to such knowledge during informal evening sessions was an incredible opportunity. "Martinez," asked Private Cooper, a young soldier who had shown exceptional aptitude during the training sessions, "how do you calculate all those factors so quickly? It seems like there would be too many variables to keep track of." Sarah smiled, one of the few times most of the soldiers had seen her show such expression. "Practice and experience, mostly. After you've made hundreds of shots under different conditions, you start to develop an intuitive feel for how various factors will affect your bullet's flight path. But there are also tools and formulas that help." She pulled out a small ballistic calculator, a device that looked like a specialized smartphone. Modern technology can help with the calculations, but you still need to understand the principles behind the math. If your equipment fails or gets damaged, you need to be able to fall back on fundamental knowledge and field improvisation. Mike had been particularly diligent about attending every training session and practicing the techniques Sarah demonstrated. His shooting had improved dramatically, though he was still far from the elite level that Sarah represented. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about both marksmanship and humility. "I wanted to thank you again," Mike said to Sarah as the group broke up after that evening's session. "Not just for the training, but for how you handled my stupidity 2 weeks ago. A lot of people would have made me look like a complete fool after those shots." Sarah packed her equipment methodically, the same careful attention to detail she showed in everything she did. "Making you look foolish wouldn't have served any useful purpose. Besides, everyone has made assumptions about others at some point. The important thing is learning from the experience." Her response demonstrated the kind of mature professionalism that had impressed Colonel Harrison and the other visiting officials. Sarah's focus remained on mission accomplishment and helping others improve their skills rather than on personal recognition or settling scores. News of Sarah's training sessions had spread throughout the base and even to other nearby facilities. Several officers from different units had requested permission to send their soldiers to observe her instruction. Captain Williams had been fielding calls from commanders who wanted to know more about the exceptional marksman who had suddenly appeared at his facility. The attention had also led to official recognition of Sarah's contributions. Captain Williams had submitted a commendation for her informal training efforts, noting that she was providing instruction normally available only through expensive specialized schools. Her willingness to share knowledge and improve unit capabilities had not gone unnoticed by higher command. During one particularly successful training session, Sarah decided to demonstrate some of the advanced techniques that had made her record shot possible. She set up targets at progressively longer distances, explaining the calculations and adjustments required for each engagement range. At 2,500 meters, she explained while adjusting her rifle's scope, bullet drop becomes significant enough that you're aiming several feet above your actual target. Wind drift can push your shot several feet left or right. The bullet's flight time is long enough that the target could move between when you fire and when the bullet arrives. She settled into her shooting position with the same calm professionalism that had impressed everyone during the original demonstration. This shot requires accounting for a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind, temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and an elevation difference of about 200 feet between the firing position and target. The shot rang out across the desert, and moments later the spotter confirmed another direct hit. The soldiers watching had become accustomed to Sarah's exceptional accuracy, but witnessing such precise shooting repeatedly never lost its impact. Each demonstration reinforced the level of skill required to achieve such consistent performance. After a while, the training session ended. Mike approached Sarah with a question that had been bothering him since the original demonstration. "Martinez, can I ask you something personal? When I was making those comments 2 weeks ago, you must have known you could outshoot anyone on this base. Why didn't you say anything?" Sarah considered the question while cleaning her rifle, a routine that had become as familiar to the other soldiers as it was thorough. Because proving someone wrong in front of a crowd doesn't usually change their mind. It just makes them defensive and resentful. I figured it was better to let actions speak louder than words. Her answer revealed a level of emotional intelligence that matched her technical skills. Sarah had understood that confronting Mike's assumptions directly would likely have escalated the situation rather than resolving it. By allowing him to discover his error through observation rather than confrontation, she had created an opportunity for genuine learning and growth. The success of Sarah's training program had attracted attention from the highest levels of command. Colonel Harrison had returned for a second visit, this time specifically to observe her instruction methods and evaluate them for potential implementation at other facilities. The informal evening sessions that had started as a way to help fellow soldiers improve their skills were evolving into something much more significant. 6 months later, the training facility had been transformed into an officially designated center of excellence for advanced marksmanship. Sarah Martinez, now promoted to staff sergeant, stood before a classroom filled with military personnel from around the world. Her informal evening sessions had evolved into a comprehensive training program that attracted students from allied nations and elite military units. The same Barrett rifle that she had cleaned that fateful morning now sat in a place of honor in the facility's museum display, along with a plaque commemorating her record-breaking demonstration shot. But the real legacy of that day wasn't the impressive marksmanship. It was the lesson learned about assumptions, respect, and the danger of judging others based on incomplete information. Mike Reynolds, now one of Sarah's assistant instructors, stood at the back of the classroom during her morning briefing. His journey from skeptical critic to dedicated student to qualified instructor had been remarkable. The humbling experience of being so completely wrong about Sarah's abilities had transformed him into a better soldier and a more thoughtful,